Intimate Judaism deals with sensitive topics and uses explicit language. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Intimate Judaism. I'm Rabbi Scott Kahn.
And I'm Talli Rosenbaum. And today we will discuss the autism spectrum and what it's like to be in a relationship and what aspects of sexuality, intimacy, and halakha and Jewish law are important for couples who are involved in a relationship when one person or both are neurodivergent.
And in order to learn more, we'll be speaking to Tzippora Price. We'll begin that conversation in just a moment. First, check out our website, intimatejudaism.com, for the full podcast archive, show notes, a free men's mikveh checklist, and more. Please subscribe to Intimate Judaism wherever you get your podcasts, rate and review, and leave a comment as well. We're also working on additional projects so that Intimate Judaism can expand its reach further. So please tell people about Intimate Judaism, share the podcast, and help us continue to grow our audience. Tzippora Price, we're really pleased to have you with us today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for inviting me, Scott and Talli. I'm really excited to be here.
Tzippora, could you give us a brief introduction to the work that you do?
I do primarily, for the purposes of this show, I think this is the most important thing I do, neurodiverse couples work, which means that one or both members of the couple is on the spectrum. Very often couples come to me after having tried many different couples therapists or different styles of couples therapy and having gotten nowhere. And the couples therapist says, I think there's an ASD component here that's interfering with our work. And then they reach out to me, refer the couple, and we start working. I work with people that I call super high functioning autism when I'm doing the couples work. And what that means is that their autism is basically invisible to people outside the marriage. So there's a very lonely component to being in this marriage. As the husband says, because we're expanding our awareness and autism is not only men. And the husband says, I think there's something about my wife. I sense something. She's not in tune with our kids at all. And I'm concerned. And he says to his sister-in-law, his mother, one of our kids was diagnosed with ASD and I'm seeing the same qualities in my wife. And the mother-in-law, the Rebbitzin says, what are you talking about? You're crazy. Look at her. She has friends. She's social. She's beautiful. She's put together. She can't possibly be on the spectrum. And he says, there's a loneliness. There's an emptiness here. And people, negate that person's emotional experience. So one of the major things that I see in neurodiverse couples is the loneliness of the neurotypical spouse. And when you have this super high functioning autism that only interferes with marital intimacy and friendship. So it's very hard to explain to people outside the relationship exactly what's missing, including another couples therapist.
All right, Tzippora, you just said a lot there, which is very good as an introduction. I want to go back perhaps even further, even more primary. Could you help us understand what autism spectrum disorder represents in a general sense? Like you spoke about people that we would never suspect are actually on the autism spectrum, but in fact do have ASD, autism spectrum disorder. Could you define ASD for us?
Okay. First of all, you should know that the DSM is having a tremendous amount of difficulty defining it. And this is one of the diagnoses that get updated every single year. And when the DSM puts out its notes, in the middle of the year, before it does a new volume, it always tries to update this disorder. So there's a tremendous amount of lack of clarity as to what is autism. Autism is a social and emotional communication disorder that interferes with the development of intimacy. So imagine that you can have friends, but you've never had a best friend. Whether you're a man or a woman, how necessary is it before you come to marriage that you've had a best friend? And I would argue that the answer is that it's essential in a happy marriage that you've had a best friend. That almost when we're dating, we should say to someone, have you ever had a best friend? And a real shocker is that you should be able to go to that best friend and say, so-and-so named you as their best friend. Is that true? And if the person says, what? Huh? They said me? That's a sign that this is not a balanced friendship. Your best friend should also name you as their best friend. So we're talking about people who go into marital relationships who really haven't developed their friendship skills. And I'm going to go out and I'm going to say that the way I define the bedrock of marriage is a strong friendship, a best friendship. And a person who doesn't understand that friendship is part of marriage is going to have a very lonely spouse.
I'm just going to jump in because, you and I, Tzippora, are friends and we're colleagues and we often discuss cases together. And I think it really is you who kind of opened my mind to this possibility of spectrum disorder in many of the couples that I have discussed with you. But there's also been times that we haven't quite agreed, probably more often when it comes to women than when it comes to men, because as you've taught me, women tend to mask their ASD symptoms a lot more. But what you're talking about as a kind of precursor, this lack of ability to form friendship, I look at as an attachment issue. I look at as possibly being related to attachment trauma or other childhood traumas, and often the dissociation or the lack of connection I would attribute to that rather than necessarily think about or go down the path of neurodivergence.
But I'm going to challenge you in the fact that we're not going to diagnose every nerdy person, every shy, awkward kid as having an attachment disorder. So what about the kid that everyone goes out to play in the playground and they're sitting and reading a book on the sidelines? We don't have to say that that kid has an attachment disorder. And in fact, when we start to call it a social and emotional communication disorder, what I've often seen, especially in women, is there's an age at which it's invisible, whereas with an attachment disorder, it would be visible from a child's very young age. This is something that as communication becomes more sophisticated, especially girl-girl communication, which by the time you hit puberty and then you hit high school, it moves into a whole world of nonverbal communication with the eyebrow and the eye roll and the shoulders and the turning away, the slight yawn that you're communicating you're not really one of us. And that's when the person who has a nonverbal communication disorder is not really getting it. And so friendships kind of stall. When girls hit puberty, who your friends are is like who your clothes are, who your earrings are. And these are the girls that get dumped and get excluded from the social circles at that time. Before puberty, a child can identify primarily with their adult caretakers and be fine and have friends and be accepted in school. When you hit puberty, your main association has to switch from the adults in your life to your peer group. And this is where people with ASD start to falter and they can't make that switch. They don't know what it means to be part of a peer group. They don't really understand what peer pressure is, which is we all know it's the wrong thing to do, but we're going to do it anyway. That's very confusing to someone on the spectrum because there's right and wrong. And if you know that something is wrong, why are you doing it? Because all your friends are doing it. That kind of thinking that appears just then in puberty is one of the big signs that a woman is on the disorder. An attachment would have appeared years and years before that.
Okay, so I think I want to direct our discussion today because we could go on forever talking between us about diagnosis and also about the kinds of couples that end up together. Because we've often spoken about how women, for example, who maybe are more anxiously attached or maybe had an absent father, not a great relationship with getting her security needs met, will often look for somebody who seems to be very loyal, very predictable. And that loyal and predictable guy also is loyal and predictable because he's very anxious and very rigid and possibly on the spectrum. So I'd like to really hear from you more about couples, because I imagine that couples who are tuning in to this podcast are specifically curious about how to deal with some of the connection, communication, intimacy, sensory, all sorts of issues that come up for couples where one partner or both partners might be neurodivergent.
Can I just interrupt with one question first, which I think is primary? You just mentioned, Talli, right now, sensory. I know that sensory sensitivity is something that's associated with autism spectrum disorder. Just before we go further, only because we haven't really talked about that so much, could you just define that and explain that before we proceed with it?
Yeah, maybe even just list kind of all the presentations and symptoms that you would expect to see.
So I'll tell you that I have a fantasy that one day we will have 15 types of ASD in the DSM, and someone who presents primarily with sensitivity to sensory issues, that will be their primary defining characteristic. So sensory issues are, our five senses: touch, taste, smell, sight, hearing. When we talk about sensory sensitivity, we're either talking about hyposensitivity or hypersensitivity, which means either the person is overly attuned to sensory stimulation, such as lights, noise, the feel, the textures of their clothes, what it's like when someone brushes past you very lightly, light touch, heavy touch. Someone is oversensitive to this versus the opposite, which is also included in sensory disorders. And we talk about sensory seeking, where someone is really tuned out from the whole sensory world.
I think that's particularly important for our conversation, given that this is intimate Judaism, only because in researching for our conversation today, Tzippora, it seems that there are certain halachic issues that come up regarding mikvah, regarding sexual interaction with the spouse, that's directly related to that question of sensory sensitivity. That's why I wanted to mention that in particular. Could you also mention some of the other behaviors, or I'm not sure symptoms is the right term, but other ways we can identify somebody, not in the general sense about having trouble with friendships, but specifically, you mentioned you wish there were 15 different diagnoses as opposed to one in the DSM, but could you mention some of these various characteristics?
Okay, so two things. Communication, 85% of communication is nonverbal. So in a marriage, when I say I love you, a neurotypical person is invisibly studying the person's face and looking for reinforcement in their eye contact, in their facial expression, in their tone of voice, in their body language, maybe leaning in that, you know what, I mean it. When I say I love you, here I am. I'm reinforcing my verbal message with all the nonverbal context and nonverbal body language that you'd expect. But what if my expression is vacant? What if I'm not looking at you when I say it? What if you say I love you to me and I don't even respond? I act like I never heard you because I didn't even know I was supposed to say it back. It's not a question, so there's no answer, right? I love you is a communication that seems very clear, but it also includes an invisible form of communication. Do you love me? Right? I love you. Now answer the question, do you love me? Well, for a person with ASD, they never heard the question. They just heard you make a statement, I love you. So why should they respond? So these would be small examples of communication that really the spouse is looking for, even if the verbal message is there. What's missing in the nonverbal message? Why aren't you believable? Why doesn't your tone of voice go up and down? Why do you look bored while we're having this conversation? And then also, why aren't you responding when I initiate a conversation about feelings and you just don't respond? It's your turn to talk, and the person with ASD never got the message that something is expected of them, an answer, because they never heard a question. So when we talk about communication, we have to realize that communication is not primarily verbal. There's the message, there's the meta message, there's the implicit unspoken message, which is usually from social conventions. And then there's the whole nonverbal world that the person with ASD is not, they're simply not accessing it and using it as part of communication. I describe it to my clients as the spouse with ASD is not using their face right now. Their face is a screensaver. It's not in use. So you're looking into their eyes, you're studying their eyes, you're looking for something that you're not finding because they're not using their face. Their face is off. But it's very off-putting when you say, I love you to someone and they don't even smile, right? You say, I love you, or hi, honey, I'm home, and they don't look up from whatever it is that they're doing.
Hence the loneliness of the neurotypical spouse and how you can almost use loneliness as a predictor for the possibility that there's something going on that is vacant when it comes to picking up on the emotional cues. And I think that what you said before about couples who come to you after being to couples therapists and not being helped by other couples therapists, it's likely because couples therapists like myself tend to use a lot of emotionally focused type therapies rather than give simple behavioral techniques like, okay, now I want you to look into your partner's eyes when you say that, or I want to explain to you what empathy is, because, the expectation is that you're going to trigger in the couples therapy room, you're going to trigger those feelings of empathy. You're going to trigger the other partner to kind of get it for their partner. And it's really a very neurotypically based way of doing therapy. Maybe you can actually speak to why your therapy really works well. What is it that you do and how you intervene with your couples, with the mixed couples especially, but also with couples where both partners have some form of ASD?
So I want to go on record and say that I think when both members of the couple have ASD, the marriages work better. If we say 85% of communication is nonverbal, but you have two people that are purely relying on verbal communication, then they're happier. They're not finding something missing in the other. If you have two people with sensory sensibilities, then they understand and can make accommodations one for the other. And these marriages seem to work better. They may have parenting challenges, attaching and attuning to the children, but in terms of being a couple, and even in terms of having a touch-based relationship, they seem to be able to negotiate expectations much more easily. I actually do, like you said, use loneliness as a diagnostic criteria that this is a neurodiverse marriage between a neurotypical and a person with hidden or masked ASD. And I also use what I call two completely separate narratives. The couple went on vacation, and when you hear from one and you hear from the other, it's as though this couple was not on vacation together. They were not in the same place. They were not having the same experiences. One has one story, the other has the other story. And very often the neurotypical might have two stories. I was miserable. This was the most miserable vacation that I ever had. I sprained my ankle and I couldn't go anywhere. And my spouse had a wonderful time. They went, they did every trip. I was alone in my hotel room and they were having a ball. The neurodiverse spouse might say, how was your trip? It was fantastic. These are all the places I went on vacation. I did this attraction. I did that attraction. I hit all the high notes. And the idea that their spouse was miserable or sprained their ankle wouldn't even come into the story. So that's the example of two narratives. A neurotypical person is often describing to you what they experienced. A person on the spectrum is describing to you what they did. So what's important, what's the focus of the story is very, very different. Also, a neurotypical person will describe, I felt distant, I felt disattached, disconnected from this person. And the spouse on the spectrum will say, what are you talking about? I was sitting next to you. I was right beside you. We're in the same room. What are you talking about? Because intimacy is not just sharing an experience, it's also processing the experience together. And the neurodiverse spouse, deficit in theory of mind, which is the ability to predict and understand how another person is experiencing something, that's not really on their radar. So they're not really processing the vacation from their spouse's perspective, that spraining your ankle could totally ruin a vacation, and sitting in your hotel room while your spouse goes hiking, even if they WhatsApp you pictures, could totally ruin the vacation for you. So you get a lack of processing emotional experiences together. I love you. I took you to Thailand. How does that prove that you love me? What are you talking about? I had a stomach flu and spent the whole vacation throwing up. What does this have to do with love?
I want to ask, because I'm a little bit confused when speaking about somebody who has ASD, to what degree are the communication issues experienced by somebody with ASD vis-a-vis someone who's neurotypical a result of having a communication problem, but the experience is similar, and the problem, so to speak, is their inability to express that experience? And how much is it that they have a fundamentally different kind of emotional experience internally? And the issue isn't so much that they can't communicate it, but that the experience is not communicable because it's different. Meaning, is it mainly a matter of not communicating it, again, using a term, properly or in a way that the spouse understands? Or is it that they simply have a different experience and they process emotions differently too? And therefore, it's not only that they don't know how to communicate it in a way that the spouse can understand, but their emotional life is fundamentally dissimilar.
Okay, so I'm going to say, in the way that I would like many different types of ASD to eventually make it into the DSM, the answer is both. You have people who have a completely different emotional life. You have people who process emotional experiences differently. And then you have people who are just not processing them. And then you have people who are processing and understanding and don't know how to communicate. So definitely couples therapy is easiest with the neurodiverse spouse who has something they want to say and needs help communicating it. And that, Talli, your example of, well, if you want to communicate your message better, so look at her, look into her eyes when you're talking to her. But what if they don't have a message they want or need to communicate? And that goes back to an idea that people with ASD may have different demands for human connection. So what happens if you have someone who feels to be happily married, we need to connect, we need to talk to each other at least an hour a week. And the other person thinks that 5 minutes is sufficient. Why do we need an hour? Nothing's going on. We have nothing to talk about. So they both view the act of communication differently. Neurotypicals communicate to generate intimacy. And mostly, for the most part, people on the spectrum communicate to exchange information. And if that information is exchanged, there's no more point to continuing the communication. And if that information is exchanged, meaning somebody else told me, somebody else told you, why do I have to be the one to tell you? Neurotypicals very much generate intimacy by sharing a story with someone. I'm telling you directly. I'm choosing to tell you. You're choosing to listen. A person on the spectrum, if you got the message, if you have the information, why is it important that I be the one to tell you? And yet you can have a neurotypical spouse who says, why did I have to hear this from your mother that you were fired from your job? But you know, why do I need to tell you? And the neurotypical spouse will say, well, let's talk about it. Why won't you talk to me? What do we need to talk about? I'm looking for a new job.
Yeah. And that's a great example because I would go to this guy's being very avoidant and what is, the avoidant attachment about. And I would not necessarily go with neurodivergence unless, of course, it was low enough on the spectrum that you can see it. What you're talking about, Tzippora, is that you see people on the very high end, high functionally, as well as intellectually and all that. So I think that part of that might mask it. The other thing that might prevent an awareness of ASD as the presenting issue is that we're looking at other issues like OCD or anxiety or rigidity or other things that are showing up that are, in addition to what you were talking about, is the lack of intimacy skills, also can be really annoying in a marriage, really, really upsetting. And that's what people are coming in with. It's not that they also, and this is the additional thing I just want to say, which you can talk about, is the not knowing. I didn't know this going in. Today, as there's a lot more awareness and couples, millennials and younger people today are happy to even diagnose themselves, are coming in with, am I autistic? But this isn't happening with our couples who are in their even 30s, but certainly not 40s and 50s. They weren't diagnosing it left and right in those days. So I was hoping that you can comment on all the things that I just threw out at you. It's a lot.
It's a lot. And I want to go back to a previous question that you asked me of how is my therapy different, which I go much more slowly. There's a lot of psychoeducation of what is it to be human, how do neurotypicals process the world, what is it to experience things on an emotional level, why do we seek out new experiences to share as a couple. I go very slowly. When I originally trained in couples therapy, you almost always saw the couple together for every session. And there was an idea that you don't see someone alone because of triangulation and alliances. I, Bashita, now see couples together and then individually, and together and then individually. And the reason this is so important is because the person on the spectrum is participating in the conversation and therapy and not processing it. They're there and they're not there. They're focusing on responding appropriately in front of both their spouse and especially in front of the therapist, trying to answer the questions correctly, trying to do what's expected of them in this totally new emotion-based situation. And that takes all of their emotional and cognitive energy. And so there's nothing left to take in during the session. What did this mean? So very often the couple will leave and it's as though the conversation never happened for the neurotypical spouse. They're looking for some signs, some integration. But that integration didn't and couldn't happen in the same conversation. So I assume going in that the spouse with ASD is going to participate in the conversation in the couple session, but they're not going to integrate it. And we're going to process it together in the individual session the next time we meet. And also, I'm going to process with the neurotypical how hard it is, how painful it is that you opened up and you shared, and then you left. And it was as though this conversation never happened. In general, if you're doing attachment-based therapy, Talli, we have the idea that if people are comfortable and we create a safe enough environment, they will know how to respond. They can be coached out. It's inside of them and we're bringing it out. Here, I'm going in with the basis that even if they understand a behavior is hurting their spouse, you know what? When your spouse walks into the room, they expect you to say, hello, how are you? And you don't. And this is hurtful. And now this is new information. It's hurtful, but they don't know what to do with it. So it's a whole separate session to say, this hurt them. Now, you would think, okay, this hurt them. So now they're going to do something with it. They're going to say, hello, how are you? But somehow they don't. And so the spouse has opened up and said, this behavior is so hurtful to me. And the person with ASD is still stuck. And I assume that they're stuck because they don't know how to change and they don't know how to apply these behaviors. So we talk about, what does it mean to enter a room? Does it mean that they come home and they haven't been in the house until now? Or does it actually mean that they were in another part of the house and now they entered the same room that you're in? What does it mean when they're working versus when they're not working? What does it mean when you're the one who enters the house? Do you have to go seek out your spouse and say hello? So I come in with the assumption that even if they get the idea that their behavior is hurting their partner, they won't necessarily know what to do with that information until we process it together and they get guidance on new behaviors.
Okay, Tzippora, I'd like to ask you if there are unique challenges that Orthodox Jews on the autism spectrum have to deal with, both in terms of finding a partner and inside of a marriage.
Okay, so I'm going to say yes. And I'm also going to say there was an assumption under your question that I would say yes, or you wouldn't have asked me. And that, by the way, is both communication and implied communication. You mentioned the mikveh. We have a whole system of halacha that's very, very strange. In any other system of halacha, we raise children to start practicing. We teach bar mitzvah boys how to put on tefillin before their bar mitzvah. We don't teach anyone how to practice Torah mishpacha before they get married. So all of a sudden, a couple gets married. They're in a whole new emotional experience, but boom, they're in a whole different halachic world simultaneously. And not just that, but it's a shared halachic world, meaning a husband may care very, very much if his wife follows all the preparations for the mikveh properly. He has a vested interest in that. So this is something that your halachic world has to be integrated into yourself. You have to learn how to practice on a different level. And also, you have to share it with your partner. You have to communicate it. Another challenge is that people with ASD, the super high functioners, the people with the invisible disabilities that I work with, they love rules. They live according to rules. Rules are amazing, and rules make the world safe. And the smarter you are, and the more comfortable you are living in your cognitive domain, the more appealing the rules are. So we come in and we say, hey, we can tell you how to run a marriage. We're going to give you the rules. But really, all those rules are just a prelude to intimacy. None of them actually create the intimacy. For the ASD spouse who's focused on the rules and not focused on the nonverbal world and not focused on processing the experience together, so they don't understand that there might be anything more to the relationship than those rules. And the rules can be practiced in a very rigid way. For example, a woman complained to me that you're not allowed to have relations during Shiva. And the day she got up from Shiva, her husband wanted to have relations. And she was astonished because she's thinking, I just got up from sitting Shiva. What are you talking about? Maybe give me a hug. And yet he thinks Shiva is over. We're supposed to have relations before you go back into Nida. So this is what we're supposed to do. And even more than that, this is what I'm entitled to. And the idea that she might be in a completely different emotional space, that this experience is so out of the ordinary, it's not even on her radar to go transition into normal life, but he is returning as rigidly as possible to normal life, to the normal way of doing things. So this creates a tremendous amount of stress on the marriage, I believe, because a person who loves rules and has halacha on their side can always manipulate or guilt the other spouse with the rules, the system of halacha, the right way to do things.
Wow. So this actually leads me to segue into this area of physical intimacy and sex and negotiations around sex, especially when there isn't a good system for recognizing nonverbal cues and the kind of dance around the flirtation around it, the are you interested, are you not interested, and even ideas of consent. It sounds like they're all very cloudy with the person who has ASD, and that can certainly affect the mood for the neurotypical partner. And then there are also, I imagine, the overwhelming experience of sexuality itself, touch, and the kind of sensory experience of it that can also maybe be limited or rigid in the neurodivergent partner. So I think that because this is a podcast that doesn't shy away from dealing with the specific areas of conflict in physical intimacy and sexuality, also where that can converge or not converge with halacha. But in general, I was wondering if you could talk about how you counsel couples who come in with sexual difficulties, desire discrepancies, or actual sexual dysfunctions that may be attributed to this particular diagnosis.
I do want to, it's very, very hard to pack so much content into one to small podcasts. So I'm going to keep stressing that there are women with ASD and they tend to be more invisible than the men with ASD. Therapists tend to pick it up less because their primary emotional characteristic is intense emotional dysregulation. These are smart women who lead with their intellect and avoid the world of emotions. And when they're forced into a place of emotions, they really don't know how to deal with it. And they may have meltdowns and tantrums to the equivalent of a toddler, preschooler. We're talking pre-adolescent. Keep me on track that I'm going to give you an example of a husband with ASD, but also of a wife. So you're the wife. You made yourself beautiful for your husband. You used special soaps, special shampoos, special perfumes. You wore makeup, which changes the texture of your lips, for example, a heavier lipstick. You wore special clothes. You went to the mikveh, and you're not supposed to shower after the mikveh. So you may have the smells of the mikveh on you. And now you come home and you want your partner to embrace you. And you have invested in your physical appearance. You have dressed up for this person who recoils from the smells, from the sensitivity, from what you've brought in, and does not understand why you would ever expect them to touch you when you've done everything possible to make yourself unappealing. And this is never a conversation that happens. You come, you stand close to your spouse, you expect a touch, a hug, some recognition that something has changed, and we've gone from nida into non-nida. What do when you come close to your spouse and your spouse is overcome with your special smells in your hand and disgusting smells in their mind, and they take a step back? That can already ruin the mood and the intimacy for a neurotypical spouse. They can feel profoundly rejected. That's it. And the evening is ruined. Where do we get to in the communication? I walked in the door. I expected you to look up and smile at me. You didn't. The kids went to bed. I went to stand near you, and you took a step back, and then you turned around and left the room. So what do we do with that? We have a neurotypical expectation. You make yourself pretty for your husband. You do the special things. You invest in your appearance. Mikveh rooms have a special room after the mikveh for putting on perfume, for putting on makeup. A good wife does these things. These may be precisely the things that will cause a man with sensory issues to recoil. Okay, that's the men. The women. She goes to the mikveh. The mikveh is an experience. You have to do it right. There's a lot of sensory experiences going on there. You come home, you've been interacting in a social world that you don't interact with regularly, and you are finished. You have no emotional energy left to deal with anyone. You just want to be left alone. It never got easier to deal with a mikveh lady. It's always confusing. You're never 100% sure that you got it right, even though she says you got it right. But if you're really looking to rigidly follow the halacha, somehow maybe a little detail slipped your mind. So you're consumed in that mikveh experience, and you haven't come down for it. And there's your husband waiting happily at home for you to come home and be emotionally open. But you're closed, you're disconnected, and you're spent. Because in order to go to the mikveh, you have to give it everything you have, physically, emotionally, spiritually. You've done it, and now you're unavailable. You're disconnected. The ASD emotional disconnect, when they're burnt out from human connection, is complete. So one example a husband gave is when my wife is burnt out, she has to go into the bedroom, lock the door, lie in her bed, put in earphones. No one can be in the room. The bedroom door can't be unlocked. Now, how would you feel if your wife goes to the mikveh and you're not expecting much, but you're expecting to be in the same room? And she goes into the bedroom, locks the door, puts in earphones, and she's out. She's disconnected. And she's only coming back to you when she's ready and she's recharged. And because the experience was so draining, it's going to take her a lot of energy to recharge. But also because she doesn't necessarily have female friends that she talks to and processes mikveh experiences with, she doesn't know that her behavior is unusual.
Then let me ask you, a lot of what you're saying, Tzippora, are the problems that accrue in this couple, particularly when one is neurodivergent and one is neurotypical. Obviously, this is too big a topic for one conversation, but can you give examples of mechanisms that couples can use to overcome that disconnect, apart from simply the recognition that they're thinking differently and to, so to speak, not to take it personally because it doesn't mean what you interpret it to mean? Are there any other things other than information or knowledge that can be used in order to help bridge that divide?
So first of all, my therapy is based entirely on making the nonverbal verbal. So what I just described to you are two nonverbal scenarios. The first thing we do is talk about them. What's it like when she comes home? How do you feel about perfume? Do you like it? Do you not like it? To even begin a conversation of the whole nonverbal world that's dividing them, that in itself is a technique. Because if you really hear that your husband doesn't like perfume, most people who are not on the spectrum will stop wearing it if they want to be intimate with their husband. What happens if you hear it and you don't process that information? That's very hurtful. So turning things into a conversation. Why did you step back? Can you explain what you were thinking? This is the technique that we use. I had an example that I think is very important for us to discuss because it tells a lot about the difference between the way people with ASD and people without ASD view communication. A couple that I'm working with, who the wife explains over and over, I feel like he doesn't love me. And he loves her. He loves her. But like you mentioned earlier in the podcast, Scott, this is a man with a message who doesn't know how to relay it. It's trapped inside him. He doesn't speak the language of feelings. So what do we do in our modern age? I say, okay, listen, very often there's synchronous and asynchronous communication. And asynchronous communication gives us the ability to assemble our thoughts, work on our message, and figure out how we want to deliver it when we're under less pressure from the other person. So why don't you try and write down, how you feel about your wife, write her a love letter. And he takes me seriously. Project writing a love letter. Now, first of all, there's a right way to write a love letter and a wrong way to write a love letter. And he's going to do this right. What do you do in our generation when you want to do something right? You use Chat GPT. Exactly. So now Project Love Letter, she gets a love letter to end all love letters. And she is so moved. And remember, we're in couples therapy. She is so moved. It makes her cry. It's so out of character for him. It is the ultimate in love letters. And a week later, because it gnaws at her, she says, "You didn't use Chat GPT, did you?" And he says, "Of course I did." And suddenly, the woman who got the ultimate of love letters, who cried, who was so moved, who saw that the husband she wanted and always dreamed of is in there, suddenly she finds out that he's not. And therefore, the letter has gone immediately from something truly moving to something meaningless for her, and maybe even something manipulative and tricky. And how could he do this to me? It's a slap in the face. What's going on in his mind? She was also doing something to show him that she cares about him. So she decided to make his favorite cake for Shabbos, and she used a mix. So now we discuss Project Love Letter and what happened. And she is devastated, right? And I say to her, when you first learn a language, you really learn a script. When I studied French, I learned how to buy a ticket in a travel agent's office. This is going way, way back. And I learned the script of having a conversation of how to buy that ticket. So your husband, I know how hurt you are, but your husband is really learning the new language of feelings. And he relied on a script. And what's meaningful here is not that he produced a letter with the help of Chat GPT. I want you to focus on the fact that he tried, that he took it seriously to write a love letter. The love is not in the letter. It was in the effort that he invested to produce it. So she says, okay, that's what we did in our individual session. But I say to her, but I also want to process this in a couple session. And she says, why? You told me to focus as though he's learning a new language, to avoid the fact that he, used Chat GPT. So I said, yeah, but it's still important to process this as a couple because I want him to understand why this was hurtful for you. And we're processing it as a couple. And he says, every time I write something, I feed it into Chat GPT. every time I give a project at work, every time I write anything, I feed it into ChatGPT to get a better version. So why shouldn't writing a love letter also be the best version? He's focused on the outcome, right? And then he says, and anyway, she was making me a cake. She used a mix. So why is this any different? Why is a cake mix different than a love letter generated by ChatGPT? Now, Talli, you're smiling. As a neurotypical, it's obvious to you why it's different. One is an emotional investment, and one is something based on the outcome, the product. But in the couple session, first, I have to explain to him why it's hurtful, why it's different for her, but in a safe, supportive environment that doesn't imply you're broken or you're damaged for having done it this way. And many therapists will inadvertently make that mistake of, well, of course you should have assumed that this was hurtful. Of course you know why this is hurtful to her. I'm going in with the assumption that he genuinely doesn't know. He took Project Love Letter very, very seriously, and he has no idea why it was a success, and then overnight it was a failure. It wasn't manipulative. It was a genuine attempt. So now I'm in a position of explaining how ChatGPT is different than a cake mix. This is, again, making the nonverbal verbal. Let's have a conversation about how it's different. And I am serious. This can be a whole session. And in fact, it was. For the neurotypical world, this is never a conversation. This is something we know. This is the stuff of old movies where he hires someone to write the love letters for his girlfriend, and she finds out, falls in love with the letter writer, and ultimately she goes off with the letter writer and she blows off the boyfriend. Yeah. So he doesn't win after making it. But here I am in couples therapy, and they're married, and I want the one who used ChatGPT to win, to enhance his marriage. So we have to somehow find a way for this to be both acceptable and non-acceptable for the future.
Definitely. We're running low on time. I want to kind of wrap up with our final questions, thinking about all the emails we might get on the kinds of questions that people have asked us before we recorded and also that might come in afterwards. But there are, I think, practical questions having to do with sexual functioning and the experience of sexuality that I think would be useful to hear from you in terms of how you might counsel a couple where one partner might have sensitivity to kissing or bodily fluids or touch, certain types of touch, how you kind of help them behaviorally or directly with maybe overcoming the aversiveness or the disgust that they might have. The second sort of related question is the, I guess, comorbidity, you would call it, of autism with perhaps asexuality or other kinds of different types of sexual presentations that seem to go together, at least according to the literature. If you see that, that's all. And then I'm sure, Scott, you have a final question as well.
Okay. So I'll start by saying, again, I think that people where both members of the couple are on the spectrum have a much easier time navigating these difficulties and just make small accommodations for each other. The way I define sexuality, sexual intimacy, is that sex is a nonverbal conversation that we have with our bodies. Let's say you've invested a lifetime in not losing control. Let's say the experience of losing control in front of another person is the most terrifying thing you can imagine. And now we're telling you that this is the best thing the two of you can do as a couple. So one, it can generate intense anxiety, performance anxiety. And I think the word you used is a bit weaker than the word I'm going to use, which is repulsion. What if you have a repulsion to bodily fluids? What if you have a repulsion to being touched in a certain way? That's a lot stronger than I don't like that. what if your repulsion is so great that it snaps you out of this experience completely? What do we do with that? The on-off switch. When we talk about sexuality being a conversation, we talk about the fact that it begins way, way, way before a couple ever gets to the bedroom. The idea that conversation begins hours before is something very, very different. For a person with ASD, very often sexuality is a conversation that begins in the bedroom. It begins when you get into bed. So I start by teaching these things that you build up from small touches to more meaningful touches to more intense touches. You can have a conversation on the couch where you spend the time looking into each other's eyes. Most neurotypical couples have an idea of pillow talk. They get into bed and they're going to talk a little. Many people with ASD do not believe in pillow talk. You go to the bedroom because you want to go to sleep. Go into the bedroom, say goodnight, I love you, put on your pajamas, get into bed, lights off, head hits the pillow, and they're out of it. So in addition to the tremendous amount of psychoeducation that happens, we have to get the person themselves to a point where they feel comfortable with the idea that sexual intimacy might involve a loss of control, and your partner is a safe person to have that loss of control with. And to just start by slowly, in the way that we do exposures in CBT, slowly exposing them to the different aspects of sexuality that are out of their comfort zone, and doing these things both alone and with their partner until they get more comfortable with the totally overwhelming sensual and sensory world that is sexuality.
Okay, Tzippora, we're almost out of time, so I don't want to ask a very long question. Perhaps this can't be answered in just a couple of minutes, but I do want to ask about balancing understanding and accountability. When a couple is together, in general, assuming they're neurotypical, if one spouse hurts the other spouse, part of the conversation is that was selfish, or I experienced that as you're being selfish. And there is a degree of accountability. And I think it's important that not everything be attributed to, well, this person has ASD and therefore it's not selfish by definition, because that's also not true. So how does one, or how does a couple, balance that sense of understanding that they're using different mechanisms to communicate or communicating differently with the fact that obviously autism can't be an excuse for behavior which is unacceptable?
Okay, so unacceptable is a huge range from you hurt my feelings to you hurt me physically. You hurt my feelings to I felt used, discarded, even potentially raped. So I'm just putting that out there, that unacceptable can mean a lot of different things. And one of the things I do in therapy is define explicitly what is acceptable and what is not acceptable. The most important thing here is for the spouse with ASD to understand that they have ASD, that they're functioning from a place of ASD, to own it, and to recognize that their partner is having a completely different experience of the world. And without a conversation, they're never going to know how their partner is experiencing the world, that they might be completely tuned out, that they're missing cues. So that's number one. The idea of owning that you have ASD and you're communicating differently is what creates accountability. You want to make sure that the ASD does not become a disability card that they can play, what I call playing the ASD card whenever they wanted, because that can reinforce a person's narcissism. So owning and acknowledging that they are functioning from a different place than their partner, and therefore they might be creating experiences that are hurtful to their partner completely without realizing it. That's what creates the accountability. And as a closing thought, I'm just going to share this with you that I see over and over. For a person with ASD, the idea that you hurt someone completely unintentionally and without realizing is extremely different. You know, the Gemara says that if you fall off the top bed bunk while you're sleeping, you hit the person on the bottom bunk, you pay damages. But this idea that I hurt them without noticing, without intending to, it's illogical. They'll say to their partner over and over, "Why are you hurt?" I didn't do anything hurt you. I didn't intend to hurt you. And they expect their partner to then have the right beliefs and alter their feelings and not be hurt. But the partner is still hurt. And so I say to them, it's like being in a room with a blind person. And they may not intend to hit you, but they may hit you over and over with their cane. And that hurts. So the feeling of pain is still there. And I say this to both members of the couple. You didn't realize it. You pushed past her. But when you pushed past her, you hit her with your cane, or you hit her with your shopping cart in the supermarket. You may not have noticed, you may not have intended, but the pain and the damage is real. And that's how we go about it. So first, understanding and establishing that pain and hurt and rejection can be real even without intending it to. The feeling of a partner being used, that you might have created that feeling even without intending to. And also empowering the other person to say, yes, I was hurt. I know they didn't mean it, but I'm stuck with this mountain of accumulated pain of the blind person in the room hitting me over and over with their cane. And therapy then being responsible to figure out how the blind person can navigate the room in such a way that they're not put in a position of repeatedly injuring their spouse.
I want to thank you, Tzippora. This has been so enlightening. I've learned a lot, and I'm really sure that our audience is learning a lot.
Thank you.
I echo what Talli said, and thank you all for listening to this episode of Intimate Judaism. Remember to subscribe, rate, and review, leave a comment, go to intimatejudaism.com, and share the podcast. We'll see you next time.
Bye.